question, which I believe is, what words come to mind when you hear the word development?
Okay, just to confirm, we have a word cloud up there. And you can enter, if you go to the polls tab, and I will also show what you're saying. So back to you, Ryan.
Yeah, perfect. So the first one is about what's the word that comes to your mind when you hear the word development? All right, so we have a lot of words coming in. People are talking about improvement. Improvement seems to be the overarching theme. We also have progress. We have things getting better, which is another way of saying improvement. We have growth. We have charity, money, change, globalization, etc. But I think the two biggest words that are coming out is that there is improvement and that there is growth. And of course, the next few questions that which will eventually come across is that what growth for whom, or improvement for whom, or development for whom. And that's what something that we'll go into in the next few sections. So broadly, let's keep these two words in our mind: growth and improvement. If we could go into the next question, which is that what is the word, or what are the words that come to mind when you hear the word policy? So when you hear the single word policy, we hear about it in newspapers, we read about it on the internet. When we hear the word policy, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Yeah, I can see, okay, government policy, law. There's a bit of politics as well. All right, rules, laws, proposed actions. All right, government policy, once again, governance, manifesto, help, regulations, excellent. So once again, now we can see that the two broad topics which are the core of what we are about to discuss today, development and policy. For development, the broad words that came out were improvement and progress and growth. I think those were some of the things that were coming out. For policy, we have governance and government, we have rules and laws and legislations. That's broadly the area. So essentially what we're about to talk about is ways in which large-scale programs can be developed either by government or by private actors, or by the partnership of both government and private actors, and how they can improve, how they can develop, how they can lead to the growth of outcomes for certain underprivileged or underserved communities. And that's what the topic of the conversation is right here. The third question that I would like to ask at this point is, and it's a yes and no question, is that do you think everyone in society faces the same level of development and progress? Do you think everybody faces the same level of development and progress? Okay, everybody is unanimously saying no. Nobody agrees to everybody getting the same level of development and progress. I think we're all united in that answer. And therefore, if we have the fourth question coming in, do you think there are certain groups in society who face barriers to accessing development? So we spoke about development being about improvement, development being about growth. So are there certain groups or are there certain categories of people who perhaps face greater barriers to face accessing that development? And of course, we are all agreeing that yes, growth and development are not equitably distributed, and there are certain people or certain categories or groups, communities who face greater barriers to accessing development than others do. Absolutely right. All right, so with this going forward, I would like to now move back to the slides. Richard, if you could help me with that. Lovely. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so who am I and what brings me here? My name is Rai. I've introduced myself before. I'm from New Delhi in India. New Delhi is the capital of India, and I'm from the capital city. I have studied economics at my bachelor's level from the University of Delhi. And currently, I'm pursuing a master's in something that is probably one of the longest sounding courses in Oxford, extremely complicated sounding, but not that complicated to study. It's the MSc in Evidence-Based Social Intervention and Policy Evaluation. I'm studying at Oxford as a fully funded Weidenfeld Hoffmann scholar. Before I came to Oxford and after I finished my graduation in economics, I worked for 3 years in India. And herein, I helped to evaluate large scale programs and policies, either on behalf of governments or on behalf of bilateral and multilateral organizations across the world. And my work focused in India, in Myanmar, and in Zimbabwe. I helped to work with UNICEF. I worked with the Asian Development Bank, with the UK government as well, and with the government of India. But the question is that kind of what brought me in this path. And of course, it wasn't an obvious choice to make. Back in 2017, I was at the stage of graduating from my sort of university in Delhi. And that's when I had a degree in economics, but I was utterly confused about what I wanted to do with my life and my future. Because at one end, I was thinking I'm going to join a corporate sort of setup and work on profit maximization for a particular company, work on its bottom line, and become a total uh, a very sort of businesswoman in some sense, and work in the corporate world in a very nice glass paned office. And that was my thinking when I was doing economics back in New Delhi. And at the same time, when I was also studying economics, I had the opportunity to volunteer with this international nonprofit organization called Enactus. I'm not sure if some of you have heard of it, but it's an organization that has chapters across different universities across the world. And my college had a chapter as well. So I had the opportunity to volunteer with Enactus. And when I volunteered with Enactus, I got the chance to build social enterprises for low and for like poor puppeteers in my city, actually. We got to build a social enterprise for low income puppeteers in New Delhi, wherein we got them to have better demand for their puppet shows. We got them to build shows on social relevant themes. And we actually ensured that these puppeteers, this community of puppeteers who were below the poverty line, were able to get puppet shows across diverse range of clients based on the kind of demand proposals that we prepared, and were actually able to raise themselves above the poverty line and have a higher standard of living, higher standard of access to education, healthcare, sanitation, and so on. And that experience changed me. I mean, sitting in those slums in New Delhi, trying to understand what it is one can do at a very micro level to change the lives of a community who was struggling to make ends meet, because nobody watches puppet shows these days, even here or in India as well. I mean, we have better things to watch in many senses, let's say Netflix. So nobody will watch a puppet show for entertainment. But how do you ensure that a particular community gets its livelihood ensured when nobody's watching their shows? And thinking about those kind of issues and making sure that we got innovative clients to fund them, that we got interesting people to partner with them, that we got the government to provide grants to those puppeteers, that got me thinking that maybe I can use my discipline of economics not just for profit maximization or not just for improving the bottom line of a particular company, but also to improve the lives of people. So it's about improving the lives of people over profit in some sense. And that's the dichotomy I faced. And eventually that got me into the field of international development and public policy, which sort of went along the way. But that's the initial motivation. I was also very confused, and I was a little older than most of you when I was still facing the confusion. So, a few years down the line, if you're still confused, it's fine. I think it will work out in the end. But that's the kind of confusion that was there all along about what to do, where my values and principles lie in terms of what I want to do, where my skill sets lie, where my interests lie, and ultimately where my passions lie. And I think all of that aligned in some sense to in the way in which it came together for the puppeteers of Kayakalp in New Delhi, and in the ways in which I could later contribute to other communities and feel, in addition to an improvement in skill sets, a deeper sense of satisfaction, which was equally important in any job that you do. So that is the broad story. Of course, I'm very happy to take questions as we go along the way. I think Richard will be sending them my way as soon as he gets them as well. But yeah, that's me, and that's broadly my story of what brings me to international development. If you could move to the next slide, please.
And just briefly, it's worth saying, right, what I'll do with the questions is this first question being asked is an absolutely fascinating one. I'll mainly come to them at the end, but where it's a question of definition that might particularly benefit from being addressed during, if you don't mind, I'll sort of interrupt and ask it at the time, but most of them, like the brilliant one that's been asked, we'll have a look at the end.
Absolutely.
Smashing.
No problem at all. So great. So this is just a slide where we'll talk about how we'll proceed with the talk. We'll talk about what are the challenges faced by women and children. We will talk about a policy intervention to promote maternal and child nutrition in Myanmar. We'll talk about a government program to promote early childhood nutrition and education in India. And then we'll go on to talk about what kind of careers are there in policy and development, right? So the essence of the talk is, of course, talk about why it is important to invest in or to promote women and child development, which is the core of what I do. It is also to bring forth case studies from the global south about how women and child development is being promoted through programs. And in some sense, it is an effort to get you all interested in such similar careers and perhaps the passion to do similar projects across the world as and when you grow up. And I'm sure you all will do wonderful things, but this is just one of the things you might consider. If you could go to the next slide, please. Right. At this point, let's pause and reflect a little bit on challenges faced by women and children. So we can just quickly shift back to Slido again. And there is a question that says that are women and children a vulnerable group often left behind in the development process? Again, a yes and no question. Great. So, of course, all of us realize that women and children happen to be a vulnerable group which are left behind in development. And when we are envisioning progress, the COVID pandemic itself has taught us how women and children are often forgotten in policymaking, neglected in policymaking, or policies are not designed in ways in which they can access benefits equally, whether it be in the form of the unpaid care economy, whether it be in the form of children not being able to go to school during the pandemic and so on. So policy outcomes which are envisioned at the top level by policymakers often do not translate to the nicest kinds of benefits for vulnerable communities and particularly women and children within those communities. And that's the core of what we're about to discuss. I'm going to skip one of the Slido questions and move straight to the seventh one, which is what are some of the unique challenges faced by women and children? This is a word cloud question. So now that we agree that women and children are often left behind in the development process and they essentially may be forgotten or neglected, what are some of the challenges that they face uniquely, which impede the level of progress that they can sort of access? Period poverty, reproductive rights, patriarchy. I think patriarchy would be like the overarching sort of cause that is leading to all these challenges. Mental health, less rights, sexism, gerontocracy, absolutely. Misogyny. So we have a lot of misogyny, patriarchy, inequality, lack of rights. I think sexism is coming across a lot. We have.
Sorry, may I pause you there? Sorry. Gerontocracy. Could we define that, please?
Absolutely. I think from what I know is that the word gerontocracy comes from the word geriatric, if I'm not mistaken, which means old, wherein essentially it means that it is a form of community wherein the elder members of the community have a greater say in making community decisions and wherein therefore the younger members of the community do not have as much. So in this case, the children of the community or the younger members have less of a say, less of rights and less of access to community resources. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so lack of access to education as well. Absolutely. So again, we have problems in education, we have problems in healthcare, particularly period poverty. We have overarching lack of rights, whether they are community rights, whether they are legal rights, whether they are sort of moral rights, and so on. And these are some of the broad challenges. So just to summarize these challenges, I'm going to go back to the slide again, and we are going to discuss these challenges a little more in depth as well. And I've broadly classified them into six categories. Right. So the first challenge that women and children face is, of course, disproportionately the lack of access to food, as well as disproportionately high levels of undernutrition. In many communities across the world, particularly in the global south, even in my own country, in certain parts of the country, there are cases wherein the women and children of the household eat after the men have eaten. As a result, they get access to less food, they get access to the less nutritious food, and automatically they experience higher levels of malnourishment, undernutrition, stunting, and wasting. So that's a challenge that is specifically faced by women and children. If we could just go to the next challenge, absolutely. So the next challenge is something which many of you spoke about, unequal access to education. In many societies, the male child is preferred over the female, and as a result, the male child receives higher education, better quality of education. For many children, of course, it's also the case that the lack of access to digital means of education has been a challenge during the pandemic. We are facing cases where there is a digital divide, wherein online classes may not be accessible to all children, and therefore that's a challenge that has been made even worse by the pandemic. So lack of access to education and quality education at that is another challenge. The third is, of course, the low levels of resource or property ownership. Across many societies and economies, you will have most of the properties owned by the man of the household, seldom by the women of the household, and very less sort of access to property or money is there, which is exercised by the child of the household, who is essentially dependent on parents for any kind of decisions that are taken and has less of an independent say in any of these matters. So, as a result of that, children have not only the lack of access to food or education, but also lack of resources or agency to be able to take action on the inequalities they face. And the same holds for women as well. Moving to the next one, many communities also have harmful social norms. Some of you mentioned FGM or female genital mutilation, which is practiced in certain parts of Africa and Asia as well. There are other sort of very harmful social norms that perpetuate gender-based violence, sexual violence, child abuse, etc., which can be, again, very, very harmful, have extremely harmful consequences for women and children, and which are perpetuated by these social norms. And finally, there is, of course, the climate risk that is an overarching risk that all communities face. But when climate disasters happen, let's say if there is a flood or a tsunami, or if there is extreme weather events, then it is the women and children who face greater challenges in accessing shelters, in being able to access resources, and so on. So you would understand automatically that not only are women and children disadvantaged in terms of the broader legal or sort of community rights that they can access, but they are impeded in development across the development process in terms of lack of access or equal access to education, equal access to healthcare and nutrition. They have less resources to be able to have a say in society. They may even face harmful social norms, and the climate crisis adds an overarching level of risk to which women and children are particularly vulnerable, right? So these are some of the challenges that I have sort of brought about. Moving forward, I'm going to be talking about two specific instances of innovation wherein women and child development was actually furthered through two programs. The first program is a nutrition program, which is based in Myanmar. The second program is an early childhood education program, which is based in India. The reason why I've brought forth these programs is because both of them are conducted at the national level, and they are conducted at in very low resource settings, wherein there is not much technological advancement in certain places, there is not much resources to invest very highly, but there are still innovative ways in which people have ensured nutritional outcomes, people have ensured educational outcomes for the most vulnerable women and children. And I've had the privilege of being part of these programs and contributing to them, so I can provide a little bit of an insider's perspective into what went on. The first program is the Maternal and Child Cash Transfer Program in Myanmar. Myanmar is a country in Asia, and it is one of the bordering countries of India as well, from where I come. So what was this program about, and what is the background to this program? Why was it being instituted? Myanmar is one of the 24 high burden undernutrition countries in the world. This means that more than one third of Myanmar's children face chronic malnourishment. They do not have enough access to good food, or if they have access to food, then it is not of good quality. And the reason why the program specifically focused on two separate states, which is the Chin state and the Rakhine state. Some of you may have read about the Rakhine state in connection to the Rohingya crisis as well. So the reason why Chin and Rakhine were chosen for this program was because they are the two most underdeveloped two most underdeveloped regions in Myanmar, with very high rates of poverty and malnutrition. So how did I come to be involved in this? This was a program that was instituted from 2019, and at that time I was working at a strategy consulting firm in New Delhi. We were given an assignment by UNICEF to actually help evaluate this program and to help understand the ways in which the government of Myanmar could improve the implementation of this program across the country. So at that time, only two states were implementing it, Chin and Rakhine. And based on the evaluation that I helped conduct with UNICEF and with two other technical team members, we were able to scale up the intervention from two states in Myanmar to the entire country. So, what was this intervention that I'm talking about? Because we've already established that Myanmar is a country that faces severe undernutrition, particularly for women and children. So, what was this intervention or program that I'm talking about? So, this program called the Maternal and Child Cash Transfer Program was launched by the government of Myanmar. And what they did was that they did a monthly cash transfer of 10 US dollars to all pregnant and lactating women in Chin and Rakhine. What is a cash transfer? A cash transfer is basically when a certain amount of money is given by either the government or by international organizations, let's say the World Bank or UNICEF, etc., in order to fulfill certain developmental aims. So, in this context, money was directly transferred from the government to every pregnant or lactating woman who was there in the Chin and Rakhine states so that she could spend that $10 a month to purchase food which was nutritious and then to feed herself and her children. That was the point of the program. And this program would continue until the child became 2 years of age or 24 months of age, because the investments that one makes in nutrition at that early stage of life are something that go on to impact the way a child grows up and the health outcomes of that child in the future. And therefore, that was the broad sort of, I would say, the broad kind of rationale behind such a program, right? So, if we could move to the next slide. Yeah. But of course, is a cash transfer enough to ensure nutritional outcomes? I mean, we are basing our assumptions on the fact that we provide cash transfer or a certain amount of cash to an underserved or a poor community of mothers. Is that enough to ensure that they spend it on food, they spend it on the right kinds of food, and they eat that food themselves instead of spending it on other things within the household? So, in order to ensure that the cash was used properly, each mother or each lactating woman in those two states also had to attend certain awareness sessions. So therefore, the program that we're talking about in Myanmar had two components. The first is a cash transfer of 10 US dollars per month given by the government. The second is an awareness session that was conducted by the local midwife, wherein various topics such as nutrition, health, what to feed your child, when to feed your child, what to eat when one is pregnant, etc., was covered. The idea was therefore that not only would the women have additional purchasing power and essentially be able to spend money, but they also knew what to spend on. And that was what the program was, and that was what we helped evaluate. If we could move to the next slide, please. And what is interesting is the way in which the awareness sessions were delivered. So it wasn't just about blandly teaching concepts in nutrition and health, because nobody would be interested. We need the communities to be interested in knowing what's good for them in terms of what they can consume during pregnancy or what they can feed their children when they're young, and particularly in the first 2 years of life. So they covered dietary diversity and food hygiene, etc., but they did so in many ways. They had posters, they had pamphlets, along with a number of games to help explain the concepts. In the pictures, you can see the midwife who is sitting with the mothers, and she's explaining it using various games and pamphlets and posters. They also had a cooking competition once in a particular state, wherein they actually helped mothers to understand, okay, what is the best thing that you can cook for your child? And they had a cooking competition. And in this way, by converting sort of larger scientific concepts into simpler tasks, into more innovative tasks, whether it be through posters and pamphlets, whether it be through a cooking competition, whether it be through uh, other sort of games. They were able to get these sort of scientific, higher technical knowledge of nutrition, of dietary diversity in very simple terms across to women, many of whom hadn't attended school, many of whom did not have the basic agency within their households to actually talk about what was right for their children. And sometimes these women were also accompanied by other members of their household. They were either accompanied by their mothers in law, or they were accompanied by their husbands. And therefore, not only did the women learn, but their husbands also learned, their mothers in law also learned. And as a result of that, there was a sort of community of awareness that was being prepared to ensure that when the child came into the world, there was not just the mother who was spending the money that she received from the government correctly, but there was the additional support provided by her husband and other family members to ensure that the support was there. And ultimately, the evaluation that we helped conduct in Myanmar back in 2020, right before the pandemic, we helped to understand that, okay, this program is actually creating certain very, very positive results. We saw that we measured the levels of knowledge for these women across these different states. And we understood that, yes, now the mothers had adequate knowledge about vaccinations, about the food that they had to feed their children, about the kind of vitamins that they had to take, about the kind of supplementary tablets that they had to take during pregnancy, and so on. And so this was a very successful innovation to be able to get points across about what was the right thing to consume at during pregnancy and what was the right thing to feed their children. And it was very innovatively done in the context of Myanmar. At this point, are there any questions which I can take, maybe?
It's nice to split things up like that, isn't it? Yes. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll field the questions that are specifically about what you've just been speaking. So the most specific one, I suppose, has the coup in Myanmar impacted the program?
Absolutely. So because of the coup in Myanmar, it is difficult to ascertain the level of to which the entire program has been scaled up. While UNICEF has its presence in Myanmar and is trying to ensure that policy recommendations follow through, because this was a government of Myanmar program, and because essentially the government had to fund it and carry it forward, the coup did have effects. We are still in touch with government agencies and with the UNICEF team to understand the extent to which the program can be supported further, and other evaluations are also being planned. But at this point, it is in a state of limbo in certain parts of the country.
How were you able to get involved in working with UNICEF, helping to make a difference?
Thanks for the question. So when I was working in New Delhi, I was working in a strategy consulting firm, and one of our clients was UNICEF. So we got a project which was funded by UNICEF, and I was one of the team members that worked on the project, and that's how I got to work with UNICEF.
And I'm going to leave the other three questions because I think they're so general. They're very much development related, but perhaps you might look at the next example, and I think they'll probably be more appropriate in reflection at the end.
All right, perfect. Sounds good. If we could move to the next one. Lovely. So the next program that we are about to discuss is based in India. This is again a program that I helped evaluate on behalf of the government of India. And this time, the highest policy-making arm in India is called Nithyayog, and that is the body that I worked with in order to help evaluate this program as well. This is a program that is not only targeting nutrition, but also education. Many of you mentioned that lack of access to education is a challenge, which children face, particularly in the context of the pandemic, which girls face because of gender discrimination. And as a result of that, nutrition and education were both twin goals of the program that we are about to discuss, which is a program that is based in India. If we could move to the next slide, please. So this is the context of India. India is a country wherein 35% of children under the age of 5 are severely undernourished. The children most at risk have very low weight at birth and very short heights for their age. And not only are the children undernourished, but the women of India, 25% of the women in the reproductive age group of 15 to 49 years also have very low BMI or body mass index, which makes them undernourished as well. So undernourishment is an important challenge in India, faced both by women as well as by children, and it manifests itself in form of different ways like low birth weight, stunting, wasting, very short height for your age, very short height for your weight, etc. And the stunting or the low birth weight that you have at birth or the low weight that one has at childhood affects one's cognitive and physical development over the years as well, and affects the kind of jobs that one can get in adult life as well. So as a result of that, it's very important to be able to invest in education and nutrition right at the level of early childhood. And that's exactly what happened in India. So this is a program called the Integrated Child Development Services. It is one of the Government of India's flagship programs for early childhood development and care. What it does is that there are certain sort of health centers, and they are called Anganwadi centers. These are the centers wherein the women and children of a particular house, of a particular village or a particular community come together, and there are trained workers within these health centers. They are called ASHA workers, which stands for Accredited Social Health Activist, but we call them ASHA workers. And they train the women or the mothers specifically, again, very similar to Myanmar, about immunization, nutrition. Apart from that, there are also nurses in place who ensure that there is like doctors' checkups that happen there. There is very supplementary education that is also provided to children under the age of 6. So a bunch of services are provided by these local health centers called the Anganwadi centers. Now, apart from sort of providing the services to women and children in need across multiple districts of India, these centers have the ASHA workers, as I mentioned, which are the frontline health workers who have done a tremendous job during the pandemic in my country as well. And they play a very important role in influencing the way in which the community perceives early childhood education, or the community determines early childhood nutrition. As you would realize that many of the challenges facing women and children have their roots in patriarchy, have their roots in misogyny, have their roots in very socio-cultural sort of contexts of sexism. And therefore, to target nutrition and education is not simply enough to just create programs about it. It's also important to target behaviors and attitudes at the community level. And one of the elements of the Integrated Child Development Services program is targeting those behaviors and attitudes at the community level. So what this does is that the frontline workers or the ASHA workers, they conduct innovative meetings with community members. The picture that you're seeing on the right is a picture that I took on a field visit to rural Rajasthan. Rajasthan is a state in the west of India. So they conduct innovative meetings with community members, and they help collectively identify problems relating to early childhood education, health problems, etc. And they use these platforms, these meetings as platforms to convince families to send their children to school, to avail of early childhood services under the scheme, and so on. So the ASHA workers essentially are like community leaders in some sense. They are frontline workers who are targeting households who are not sending their children to school. They will meet with community influencers, community members, community influencers like the village headman, let's say, or the priest, or the school teachers, and they will find ways in which they can collectively get the community to agree on certain aspects, whether it be that, okay, we need to send our children to school, or okay, we need to invest better in our healthcare systems, etc. And that's what the purpose of these meetings is. And the ASHA workers as also use interesting games or innovative games as methods to convey messages. So it's not simply enough to read from a list of things as to, okay, you must do this or you must do that. It's important to actually have innovative ways in which these messages will stick in the minds of people. And that's exactly what the ASHA workers do as well. So the ASHA workers use games as methods to convey messages. For example, there is a sequencing game for planning a safe birth if the birth is happening at home. There is a storytelling game that talks about ways in which women's nutritional status can be improved, a voting game to explain the complications in pregnancy, and so on. So by using innovative ways to convey messages, by using innovative ideas about how, let's say, how policy changes can happen at the micro level, the ASHA workers are making tremendous sort of changes at the local level. I remember meeting one such Asha worker back in 2019 in India, where her name is Shantabai, and she is somebody who did not get to access secondary education back home in India before she got married at the very young age of 17 years of age. And afterwards, when she got married, she actually went on to do her bachelor's degree and her master's degree in sociology, and went on to change the community's profile in terms of health and nutrition single handedly through these innovative community meetings and by convincing the village elders and other members of the community on how to change attitudes. So she was a very inspiring woman. She's one of the people who continues to inspire me even today in terms of the work she does. And that's why I definitely thought of bringing this case study up to you in terms of how, even in very low resource settings, even when the odds are against you, there are high levels of undernutrition, stunting, wasting. There are also ways in which you can intervene. There are ways in which innovation can play a role in how the next generation of children are born, the next generation of children access healthy and nutritious lives, the next generation of women, or even the current generation of women, are able to access safer pregnancies, better immunization, and better healthcare. Finally, moving on to the last section, which is careers in the sector, after which I will take up even more sort of questions regarding this. So there are many ways in which you can sort of enter the sector, and they are kind of broadly defined on these five clouds, but we can go more in depth into the conversation as we move forward. So in terms of the avenues to join the sector, the first way in which one can join the sector, if particularly one has a research inclination, is to join a research institute or a think tank. For example, if you're interested in doing gender-based research, then the International Center for Research on Women, or ICRW, is a very interesting place to work in. We also have Jpal, which stands for the Jamil Poverty Action Lab, which are doing very interesting work in terms of testing programs across multiple settings and understanding how certain interventions or how certain programs are better suited to fulfill community needs than others. So if you have a research background and a research sort of way of thinking or interest, then that is a way in which you can impact change. If you are looking to impact strategy level change or broader level change, then bilateral and multilateral organizations are an interesting place to work in. So you have all the UN agencies, including UNICEF, UN Women. You have the Asian Development Bank, where I'm currently working as a part-time consultant. You have the World Bank as well. So again, these are organizations that have sort of offices across multiple countries. They offer opportunities for travel to multiple countries. They also offer opportunities for learning from multilingual and multinational teams. And so if that's your interest area, then this is the way forward. There are also ways to impact sort of change and development back home. If one is interested in working in equality research for the government side, then I think the Government Equalities Office is an interesting place to work in the UK. The UK Civil Service as well is an option to work in public policy and international development as well. Particularly if one goes on to work for FCDO, which is the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, which looks at international aid from the UK government side. If one is looking at private sector, there are many options such as strategy consulting as well as strategy development. So we have Dalberg, which is another international development consulting firm. One of the offices is in London. We have organizations like Ecoris, etc. And we have the Big Four. The Big Four are Deloitte, KPMG, PwC, and Ernst & Young. And all of them have government advisory or policy advisory sections to them, which work specifically on policy assignments, so to speak. And finally, if you're interested in working on ground and translating policy into real-time change, then I think working on the implementation side, either with an NGO, which is a non-governmental organization, or an INGO, which is an international non-governmental organization, such as Save the Children or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc., would be an interesting place to work in. Particularly to ensure that not only are you working at the strategy level, but also that you're implementing changes and ensuring that they translate to something very tangible and practical at the micro level as well. So with this, I have broadly laid out the kind of options that are available to everybody, and I think this is the time to open up everyone's two questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to take with these in due course. Some fantastic questions come through. We've already had a look at a couple.
Right.
I'll start with one that's a little bit left field. Did you? But it's not really. It comes into that possibly everything you do. Did you ever consider being a politician yourself when you decided you needed to make a change?
Um, I won't say that it's never crossed my mind. Having said that, I feel that my skills are better suited to work perhaps more in research and in international development from a sort of bilateral, multilateral side rather than working in politics. Uh, I mean, my course itself is called evidence-based social intervention. So I think evidence creation, evidence generation, and evidence use is something that I align myself with, and that sometimes may not translate entirely to politics in certain cases. So I did want to stay a bit towards the other side of things, on the research side of things. Yeah.
I suppose in a broader sense of the question as well, I mean, maybe in a much broader sense of the question, you might have effectively been a politician in many aspects of your work. You're just not a politician with a sort of capital P seeking votes, you know, because you've got to be diplomatic and so on. I'm just flicking through that presentation again because one of the questions was very straightforwardly just in terms of possibly being able to get in touch with you for more information. So there's Rye's details. But like all this, I'll put this in a PDF and send this to all registered. So that'll be available for you there. Likewise, our details for further contact. But yeah, you'll have all that in the PDF. So come back to the questions. How do you find being a woman who studies economics or has studied economics? Effectively, you still are, aren't you? Because economics is a big part of what you do.
It never ends.
And the question is, the question continues. I've been studying economics A level for the past year, and I find that you're not taken seriously as a girl.
I agree. And I think that's the case that is in most of the sciences in certain senses and across many careers as well. Having said that, I think every time we, as women or as girls who are working in sort of STEM subjects and even economics, are working hard towards it and are making the difference even in our own personal ways, we are paving the way for others to come forth as well. I can relate an example. I was on a research visit in in northwestern India about 5 years back. So I looked much younger than I do right now, and perhaps was not to be taken very seriously. I was one of the enumerators who was taking interviews of local farmers regarding certain programs that the government had implemented at that time. And I had a male colleague with me, and it was me and myself. And I was equally trained as my male colleague to ask the questions and to take the interviews. But all the male farmers, and who were all male, of course, were only answering the questions that were posed by my colleague. So whatever question I asked, they would either look at my colleague and answer, or they would not answer at all. So these are some of the challenges that even I have faced at the field level when I was working as a field researcher. Um, and that continues to happen as well as across the board. Only a piece of advice I would give is stick to it. It's hard, it's challenging, and sometimes it's really demotivating to think that even after you've worked so hard, there are certain structural inequalities that refuse to bend. But I think, for example, the next day, what I did was I was extremely firm when I went for the interviews again for the second round, and I explained to them that I am as qualified as my male partner or colleague in what I did. I explained my credentials, and I was extremely firm in my resolve about getting my point across. And they did start to take me more seriously, and that worked. So, of course, it might not work in every setting. Every setting is different, but I would say stick to it because it's worth it in the end.
And a question that follows on beautifully, you've already partly addressed it, I guess. How do you adapt trying to get policies implemented in cultures where women are deemed inferior?
I think in many senses, women are deemed inferior across most cultures, whether it be, I mean, there's just the different manifestation. In certain countries, it may be that they are lacking access to like nutrition or education, which in a hierarchy of needs may be seen as more basic rights. In other countries, it may be the lack of equal pay, the lack of representation. So I wouldn't say that a particular culture has an attitude that is against women. I think it's a universal concept. So inevitably, when one works in women and child development, you are looking to change these attitudes. And this can happen at multiple levels. You can work either with policy making and strategy building at the national level, wherein, let's say, you're creating large scale policy documents which sort of pave the way for future programs to be developed and influence the way in which the nation thinks about it. For example, in 2021, right before I came to Oxford, I was helping to build India's National Gender Index, and that's the first one that's being built right now. So I think developing measurement indexes which look at measuring gender equality, etc., is one of the ways forward. Another way is to get political and policy buy-in. So it's very important to have conversations with national level stakeholders, whether it be civil servants, whether it be ministerial officials, etc., and to get the point across and their buy-in on policies that can be implemented. Because once that kind of national level buy-in is present, it's easier for the resources to trickle down to more local levels. Um, Finally, innovation plays an important role, as you would have seen that whether it be the use of games, whether it be the use of community influencers, it's very important to get innovation in the picture when you're looking to adapt different countries to different newer dimensions of gender equality.
You beat me to a subsidiary question there, which was part of the question, in cultures, and I'm sure the person who asked the question was implicitly suggesting it as well, in cultures where women are deemed inferior, not just limiting that to the so-called lesser economically developed world, I'm interested to expand on that, though. There's a perception, for right or wrong, and probably wrong, because there's a generalization in, say, the UK, that that perhaps patriarchy might be more removed, but still in place, but just more removed than in other cultures. And I would certainly, for one, contest that. Have you got any impressions, speaking as somebody from India now, obviously based in the UK, from your own perspectives, which are clearly wide, on that, the idea of the UK being a patriarchal society?
I can give some examples from my own experience, and I think so. Some of you may have studied this in economics. There's a concept called the coupling of disadvantages, wherein your various identities play a role in disadvantaging you. So, if you're a girl, you're at a disadvantage because you're female. But if you're a girl of or person of color who's a woman, then there is two disadvantages that you're facing: your race and your gender. And it goes on and on. If you are a person of color who's identifies as female and is, let's say, facing a disability or something, then it's three identities that are working against you. And so there is a sort of additive process to the whole story or the narrative. So for me, when I came to Oxford, it wasn't just being a woman, it was being a brown woman. And that meant that it wasn't just facing gender discrimination or being mansplained to by certain professors or in certain cases peers, but also in certain cases it's about the kind of racism you face, implicit or explicit. So I wouldn't say that patriarchy is dead. In the UK, it's very much alive as it is in other cultures. It's just the manifestation is different.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for being so candid with your answers as well. I hope you appreciate that was the perspective I was coming from. I was reminded a very public figure whose name I'm not going to mention, but he's about as public as it could possibly be and about as highly prominent, of somebody in UK public life who a few years ago, in a debating chamber in Parliament, had a little discussion about whether somebody was a girly swat or not. And I was just about to give that as an example of patriarchy and so-called removal of patriarchy in our societies. But let's not get political. Heaven forbid that. Right, I'd like to say huge thanks for the way you've talked about your experiences, particularly in the field. You've contextualized development studies and how it comes in a sort of university studies. And you've also been so candid in terms of some of the really fantastic questions we've had tonight. So thanks very much. Thank you all to our guests for asking such great questions, participating in polls, sharing your ideas. And yeah, we will send the follow-up email, which will have a PDF and also a recording of Rai's session tonight, so that you or your peers who haven't been able to join us tonight can do so. Thanks very much from all of us. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.